Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction and the rest of you for inviting me here. I apologise if I'm responsible for everything being conducted in English. I do speak a bit of French, but no other European languages. Now, this presentation is a bit incoherent in the sense that the topic related to colonialism is a new one for me. As Rebecca said, I've written extensively on popular science in the early 20th century, focusing on Britain. I've done a bit of work on French popular science in the same period as well. And I assume it's because of that that I'm invited here, more than for the Darwinism, which I kind of moved beyond in much of my recent research, but I had never focused particularly on a theme to do with colonialism in my popular science work. But I thought that if I was going to give a presentation here, I should do something to move the work on in that direction. So I started scouting around for possible topics, thinking mostly in terms of popular science writing to do with the evolutionism, zoology, the environmental sciences, things that I had worked on in more detail before. And so what I've come up with is actually a bit of a mixed bag of topics derived from starting points in my own previous experience. One of which to do with Canada is based on old material that I'm familiar with from working in that area when I actually lived in Canada. The other to do with Britain's Indian Empire and popular literature linked to that is a new part of the thing, and so that is now very much work in progress. And in fact, I spent the last several days in the University Library in Cambridge ploughing through books on Indian natural history and hunting, shooting and fishing and things like that. And there's lots more to do in that area. So this is very much an introductory presentation with some suggestions, many of which would involve a lot of further work on my part or somebody else's in order to fill the whole thing in. But I hope it gives you some ideas that you can will bounce off your own research in a useful fashion. Just some background reading there, and if anybody wants a copy of this presentation, I'm sure that they can take that, so that you don't need to scribble it all down. Just a few relatively recent books which deal with this sort of thing, popular literature dealing with the environment. The latter one, I think I've got an essay review coming out in ISIS fairly shortly. But there's a fair bit of literature generally on popular presentations to do with the environment and the empire. But none of these, I think, focus specifically on topics that I'm dealing with, but they were useful background reading. So what I'm talking about is the British Empire. Most of my work is in the British popular science literature, and much of what I'm doing is a spinning off from that. But I've become very interested in the issue of popular science literature, which is aimed both at readers back home in Europe who want to know about the colonies, but also the Europeans who moved to the colonies and who were actually living there and wanted to know more about what was their own environment that they were experiencing. Now, one thing I'm not doing, as I've said, it says at the second point there, is going into the issue of how the European naturalists and writers depended on indigenous people for expertise and information and guidance and advice in amassing the information they did. I'm very much aware that this is an important issue and that people dealing with this field are very much concerned with that, and I entirely appreciate it, but because I'm coming at the project from a background in British popular science, the readers who read that, I'm focusing on literature aimed at European readers, leaving aside what I accept to be an important issue about how that relates to the indigenous people of the various countries that I'm dealing with. There are clearly projects that are being done there, but it's not part of my project because of the origins of it. Now, the phrase "at home and abroad" I chose deliberately because it's ambiguous in this context. I mean, at home we tend to think of meaning Europe, or in my case Britain, and abroad meaning the colony, which might be Canada or India or Malaysia or wheresoever. But of course, once you get a substantial European population in the colony, you've got another audience emerging there for English language, popular science, popular accounts of the environment, and their interests and so on may be significantly different to those of a reader back at home in Europe, or in this case Britain. And as you get a publishing industry and scientific societies and so on emerging based in the colony, you've got that very different audience. And so what's the relationship between literature targeted at that audience and that is being published back home, in this case mostly in London? Now, popular material about the environment, it strikes me, can be developed in two different ways. One is focusing on the economic potential of the colony. Obviously, the colonizing nation is often very interested in what it can get out of the colony, and the Europeans who move there are very much concerned with how to exploit the resources of the environment they've moved into. So discussing the sort of natural products and how you can adapt the local environment to produce more and so on is one topic of obvious interest, both at home and abroad, but of more directly practical interest to those who are actually living in the colony and who depend on understanding these things for their way of life. But the other aspect of it, the particular relevance to the reader in Europe, is a sense of the exotic and the sort of adventurous nature of going out to conquer the environment in an exotic area where things are very different to what they're experiencing in their lives back in Europe. So, particularly with a case like India, you're reading about people who are encountering tigers and leopards and poisonous snakes and things that are pretty scary and pretty exciting to somebody living in Europe, where we don't have anything like tigers and leopards anymore, and what poisonous snakes you do have, you certainly don't get in Britain. So there's a sense of the exotic, the adventurous, the popular literature about the other parts of the world, including the colonies, is something that is meant to evoke a sense of excitement and interest in the exotic, which is very different, I think, from the more practical aspects of what we can try and get out of the colonial environment. I'm probably, and certainly for the Indian material I talk about, I'm going to be mainly concerned with this latter aspect of it. how do you react to tiger hunting and so on in India. Now, my focus is on the British Empire, and the choice of my topics is determined partly by the fact that I've lived in two of Britain's former colonies. I spent 7 years in Canada, 3 years in Toronto getting a PhD and 4 years in Winnipeg teaching, and that was on either side of 3 years in Malaysia, which again was a former British colony, and in a sense was the eastern fringe of Britain's Indian empire, which I've always had an interest in, part because I'm a fan of Rudyard Kipling and have a large collection of Kipling first editions and so on. So I'm drawing on those two experiences. Of course, they're different kinds of colonies. Canada, along with Australia and New Zealand, was a colony where Britons were emigrating to in large numbers and were largely displacing the native populations, and there's a whole story there that I'm not going to go into. Whereas in India and Malaysia and Southern Africa, European immigrants were not replacing the indigenous population. They were moving in to take control of them and to exploit their labour for exploiting the natural resources. So there is a significant difference there. The people who moved to Canada were almost certainly going to spend the rest of their lives there, and their children would be raised there and stay there. People who moved to India were there, in a sense, on a temporary basis. They would possibly go back to Britain once steamships were plying the oceans regularly. You could go back maybe once every 5 years for a furlough back home, and they may have retired back to Britain at the end of their career in India. But even so, there were a lot of people by the early 20th century, a lot of people spending their whole career in India or Malaya or South Africa, and they were, to that extent, a resident population of Europeans, sufficiently large by the early 20th century to start having their own natural history societies and scientific societies and publishing houses, publishing material for them in the colony, in this case in India. So the difference between the two might not be quite as significant as you would first imagine. Another change is that if we go to the 19th century, the middle years of the 19th century, you perhaps still got a sense of exploration. The world is being opened up, Africa is being opened up, even India, certainly the remote regions on the Himalayas are still being explored. But as you move into the late 19th and the 20th century, that exploration side of the thing is dying down, and although there's plenty of press focus on exploration, it's now increasingly the Arctic and the Antarctic rather than the parts of the world that are being actively colonized. And it seems to me that that aspect of the popular literature that focuses on the exotic and the adventurous and the exciting side of it is increasingly interested in things like big game hunting, the things that characterise the European sort of domination of the environment, going out and killing large animals, which sounds pretty gruesome to us today, but I want to suggest that there is in fact a significant interaction between hunting and natural history, because the people who hunt big game animals have to know a lot about those animals and the environment they live in, and when they report their hunting activities, they are indirectly reporting that information about the animals. And although there's a huge amount of literature about hunting published back in Europe, and this is in my case in Britain, which is presumably being consumed by people who find it exciting and interesting, Of course, for the Europeans living in India, tiger hunting is, any army officer based in India would go tiger shooting if he got the chance. It was part of the everyday life. Poisonous snakes sounds a bit exotic here, but you've got to live with it. I did in Malaysia. We had poisonous snakes in the garden and poisonous centipedes in the house and things like that. Things that are sort of exotic to the person resident in Europe are every part of everyday life to the European actually living in the colony, and that will imply some difference in the kind of literature that would be aimed at those two readerships. And the other aspect of it, as I say, is that as the European population expands, starts to settle down, get organised, and you get the emergence of societies devoted to the study of science, technology, and natural history, and often focused for the local population on descriptions of local species and how to exploit the environment through agriculture, mining, or whatever. And this illustrates two societies that I'll say a little bit about in the Canadian part of my talk at the beginning. I'll say something about the Montreal Natural History Society, which was founded in 1827, and in the Indian section later on, I'll say a bit about the Bombay Natural History Society, founded much later in 1883, both of which are still going today. And as I understand it, the Bombay Natural History Society, Mumbai we call it today, is still India's leading natural history society. Okay, so starting with the Montreal Natural History Society, as an indication of popular interest in science or natural history in Canada, it's founded in 1827, not very successful at first, just a relatively small number of people staggered along. Then later in the century, the 1850s onwards, John William Dawson of McGill University became the president and was very active in using the society to promote the study of science, natural history, geology, fossils, which were his speciality in Canada. And here's an interesting aspect to the colonial situation in Canada. It's a hell of a lot closer to the United States than it is to Britain. Now, don't exaggerate how easy it was to get from Montreal to New York in the 1850s. It wasn't very easy. It was still easier than getting back to Britain, where you had to come across the whole Atlantic. So you have a curious situation in Canada where the early scientific societies and natural history societies are tending to engage a bit more readily with counterparts south of the border in the United States than they are with Britain. Although they're very keen to arouse interest in Britain, it's simply practically easier to interact with the Americans. And Dawson was responsible for getting the American Association for the Advancement of Science to come to Montreal for its annual meeting in 1857, and there was a second meeting then in 1882. But the British Society for the Advancement of Science didn't come until 1884. I think that's their first meeting outside the UK, if I remember rightly, but I stand to be corrected on that one. So it's interesting that you've got here a colony that's actually got closer ties with another country that's not the colonising country, I mean, unlike, say, Australia or New Zealand, where there isn't any comparable interaction with a neighbour. This is Dawson, taken from the cover of Susan Sheets Pineson, very good biography of Dawson, which covers his activities in promoting science in Canada and his global reputation, which is interesting, because Dawson does get a global reputation for his popular writing, but it's not on his Canadian science. He is recognised as an important figure in paleobotany and gives a major lecture to the Royal Society in London, although they refused to publish it in the Philosophical Transactions. But he becomes a well-known figure globally in Britain, America, and around the world for writing on science and religion. Nothing to do with his Canadian background. He was a Protestant living in Montreal, which of course is largely a Catholic population, a French-speaking Catholic population. The Protestants feeling somewhat under threat from the rising influence of the Catholics, and McGill University was seen as a bastion of Protestant education, particularly in the sciences. And Dawson is deeply religious, and as a result of that becomes an opponent of Darwinism once the Origin of Species is published, and someone who defends what I suppose we would call creationism today, and a more biblical interpretation of Earth history. He's not a young Earth creationist, but he does want to see the history of the Earth as somehow being, in an allegorical sense, a manifestation of what's revealed in Genesis. And he publishes enormously in popular literature, particular literature to do aimed at a religious readership in America and in London. And his books, although they appear in Canada, are printed extensively in London and New York, and he becomes known in the later decades of the 19th century as one of the most active opponents of Darwinism who has some scientific credibility. This is, he's not just seen as an outsider with no scientific experience. He is a real scientist. I'll give you an example there, his book, The Origin of the World, but there are half a dozen or more other major books attacking Darwinism and promoting an interaction between religion and science. And it seems to me that this impinges on quite an important issue, which is, for someone like Dawson, using a reputation gained outside the colony to boost his influence within the colony. As someone who is fighting, in his case, to defend Protestant education in Montreal, and also to encourage the Canadian government and the provincial government to put money into science and science education. And they're often very suspicious of that. The colonial governments were notoriously penny pinching and notoriously hard to convince that science was a paying proposition. And it's, I think, fairly clear that Dawson's international reputation as a writer on science and religion, which has nothing to do with the Canadian scene, for him has a role in terms of giving him a higher level of visibility and credibility within Canada in his dealings with promoting science, and in particular Protestant science. So this, I think, is an important side here where popular science slides off into non-colonial areas, yet indirectly still has an implication in the colony. Another example I came across while working in Canada is John McCoon, a botanist, later the provincial national botanist, but in the early years actually involved with the exploration of Western Canada in the project to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, which of course is hugely important to Canadians. It's the railway that made the country possible. Without the CPR, BC and the rest of Canada would not have joined together. So this is an extremely important thing there. McCoon was the botanist on those explorations, and he visited the prairies of southern Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and writes his book, Manitoba and the Great Northwest, promoting an image of the prairies as wide open for European-style agriculture, for taking over to replace the native grassland with wheat, basically. And a little later, he goes on a lecture tour around Canada, which is gets a huge press report and also gets reported widely in Britain, although I haven't really followed that up in any detail. This is, if you want more details, this is the cover of Eliza's biography of McCoon, and that's him with the cap talking to a young disciple about a plant at some point in his career. Another book that deals with these issues is Susan Zeller's Inventing Canada, which deals with McCoon and with the Geological Survey and one or two other areas of Canadian science. This is all stuff that I used to be deeply involved with when I lived in Canada, but have gradually lost contact with over my years in Northern Ireland. But McCoon's popular accounts of his exploration on the prairies were to have an important influence on Canadian expansion, because it encouraged the view that the prairies were useful for agriculture, and the route of the CPR was moved further south to encourage access to those parts of Canada, and settlers moved in. The only problem was McCoon had visited the prairies with an unusually wet year, and in fact the prairies were extremely dry, it's quite arid, and farming European style is actually very, very different, and many of the settlers were hit by droughts and lost their crops completely, and some of them abandoned the land and so on. So there was, this was very important in encouraging emigration from eastern Canada out west, and hence indirectly from Britain over to Canada. But it turned out to have, rather unfortunate consequences for some of those settlers. There were other explorers who knew perfectly well that McCoon's visit was not providing him with an insight into the typical environment of the prairies, and who attacked him vigorously, but they were kind of poo-pooed and rushed for an enthusiastic move west. So here's a case where popular science has a significant social impact on how the colony develops. Another example, which I did do a bit of work on, because of my interest in geology, I became interested in later Sir William E. Logan, who was the first director of the Geological Survey of Canada. And he provides a classic illustration of the difficulty of encouraging the government, in this case the Canadian government, to invest in science, because the government thought that a geological survey was basically a sort of glorified prospecting expedition. It's just going out there to discover useful bodies of ores and minerals to exploit. Where, of course, for Logan, that's a byproduct. He wants to understand the geological structure of Canada. So the government was quite sceptical, and there's at least 1 year when Logan ran the Geological Survey of Canada out of his own pocket, because the government wouldn't provide the annual grant to keep it going. Now, admittedly, that's just Logan and a couple of assistants, but even so, he did it out of his own pocket and went off on his regular summer exploration expedition at his own expense, and the government then picked up later on. Now, Logan didn't write any popular science as far as I'm aware, but he does have one important impact on the popular conception of Canada, because he was put in charge of organising the Canadian display at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. and he subsequently repeated that with the exposition in Paris in 1855. And I don't know much about the Paris exposition, but the London one, the Canadian exhibit was widely praised, it was widely noticed in the British press, and drew a lot of attention to Canada and its potential. And Logan again got similar in a different way to Dawson, gets a lot of international credibility and exposure because of his work on the exhibitions, which then, of course, does him a lot of credit back home, because it's much more difficult for the government to play down his demands for funding when they know he's got this reputation for reputation for representing Canada at these expositions. This is an image from the press at the time of the Canadian exhibition, the Canadian section at the Great Exhibition in 1851. Much of this was concerned with the economic potential of Canada for minerals, for timber, for furs, and so on. But if you note the canoe there, this again creates that image of the exotic. You know, the Canadian fur trapper was seen as one of these explorer, adventurer, hunter-trapper kind of figures, conjuring up this image of the exotic and the exciting in Canada, and of course other parts of the colonies. So the Great Exhibition, in a sense, had an impact in both of the areas that I mentioned, the economic and the exotic. That's just fills in the points I've just made. I'm sure I should have changed the slide before I started talking. Now, this again raises a problem for me in terms of the colonial environment, because the Great Exhibition was the exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. It wasn't a colonial or an empire exhibition. Canada and Australia were there, along with America, Russia, the older European nations, South America, whatever. There's no privileging, particularly obviously, of the British colonies of the empire in 1851, and in fact most of the big international expositions are global, which raises the interesting point about colonial material is embedded in them, but if it's not particularly highlighted, we need to think a little bit about how that's affecting perception of the colony if it's just listed alongside other equally exotic and exciting areas that are not colonies. And this fits in with, I think, a growing perception amongst historians that Britain's sense of sort of imperial destiny is only a particular strand in British cultural history. It's not the only one. And the reason this came to my attention, and just to carry on, there was the first Colonial exhibition was 1886. It wasn't a high-profile event. I hadn't even heard about it until I came across the reference to it by accident in Sheets Pynson's biography of Dawson, where it briefly notes that although he wasn't there, he was quite keen on it. It's only in the 20th century that we get the really big British Empire exhibitions, one at Wembley in 23-24, and then one at Glasgow in 1938. That self-conscious imperialism, focusing on British colonies and the British Empire, as something we should relate more actively to than other parts of the world. It's a somewhat later development, and I became interested in this because I was reading, when I was doing this, David Edgerton's recent book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, in which he makes the point that at the start of the 20th century, most British people were well aware that the country was not just trading globally with the empire, it was trading globally. And Britain's trade, for instance, with South America was huge. Britons were helping to build the railways, investing in railways in South America, and once the refrigerated ships were invented, Britain's beef came from South America. So the average Briton, Egerton is arguing, was quite well aware that his everyday life was drawing on interactions with the whole world and not necessarily privileging the British colonies, and that the decision to focus on the empire and to build a deliberately imperialist ideology is a distinct strand which is not necessarily shared by all the British people or all the British political parties and so on. And so this question occurs to me that if we're talking about the exotic, it's not necessarily colonial. How do we separate out the colonial interest from the global interest in the exotic? I became conscious of that, partly through the example of the Great Exhibition. So we now move on to the exotic in popular natural history. This is where I start to move on to my interest in India and the Indian Empire, and using not so much the focus on the practical implications, but on the exotic character of the empire as represented by, for instance, hunting, big game hunting narratives. Now, I went back to my book Science for All to look at examples that I had studied years ago of British popular natural history. Now, obviously, the popular natural history will include an awful lot of natural history related to the home environment. What are the birds and animals you see, and plants you see in Britain? But they also have a separate dimension of global, worldwide natural history, particularly arousing attention in the exotic, in the exciting, in the adventurous and the dangerous animals that are found around the world. And my book contains lists of a number of these. And it struck me as I went back to look at them, or my notes on them, that again, they don't tend to focus on the British Empire. The exotic is exotic on a global scale and often does not privilege those parts of the empire that were, as we used to say, coloured pink on the map, the British Empire. There are exceptions. I list one there, a big multi-volume natural history published by Harmsworth, the publisher, that's Alfred Harmon, the publisher of the Daily Mail, big, very active in promoting popular science in the early 20th century. And Sir Harry Johnston, who was an African explorer and later an administrator in South Africa, has a chapter in this Animal Life of the British Empire, pointing out that the empire is particularly well suited for anyone to go and study exotic animals, because they've got more or less all of them in the empire. You don't have to go outside the empire to see the exotic. But that's relatively unusual. Most of these things don't particularly privilege the empire. And this is where I have my minor interest in French popular science comes in. Amongst my collection of French popular science, there's some issues of a magazine called Sciences et Monde. And I found, go through this, that there is, in 1934-35, a whole series that runs through it's 8 or 9 issues of the magazine on the natural products of French colonies, La France d'Outre-mer. And it's quite subconsciously drawing on an interest in the French colonies. And since then I've seen French books focusing on products, natural products of French colonies. Now, certainly in magazines, I went back to look at the contents of my list of contents of the British popular science magazines of the period, and I could find no equivalent of that series explicitly focused on the country's colonies. There are articles on the colonies, on the natural resources, on engineering projects, on the wildlife, but they're just isolated pieces spread out amongst all the other material that's published. There's no self-conscious attempt to focus on the colonies, British colonies, as there is in this French example. So we have to be a little bit careful in working this out, the relationship out. And this moves me on to my interest, which not, as I say now, is not so much on the natural resources, but on things like big game hunting as a source of information on natural history and in promoting public interest in natural history. And here there is a large body of literature. And I'm only just starting to learn just how many books were published in London on Indian big game hunting and African big game hunting. And there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of them in the late 19th and early 20th century. And many of these are specifically based on particular colonies, especially India and Africa. Although, again, there is this problem of the separation. And I list here a book, and I'll show you the cover of it in a moment, called The Daring Deeds of Hunters and Trappers, a collection published in 1917. And although it's full of hunting narratives extracted from this huge range of individual books, there's an awful lot of natural history there. Because, as I think I mentioned at the start, hunters have to know something about the animals they're hunting and the environment they live in. And if they're giving a detailed account of how they go out to hunt, they are going to provide a lot of information of interest to naturalists. Now here's the cover of that book. I've owned this book since I was a teenager. For some reason I picked it up from a second-hand shop when I was at age about 15 or something, and it's remained on my shelves ever since. Unread until comparatively, well, I think I read it at the time, but unread until recently. Now, the interesting thing about this cover is that although the book itself does not specifically focus on the British Empire, it has hunting stories from all over the world, including Siberia and America and South United States and South America, all over the world. The cover is clearly two scenes from India. You've got pig sticking on the spine of the book and a tiger hunt, which in this case, as the story tells you, it was the native who killed the tiger with his machete, not the white hunter with his rifle standing in the background. So although the content of the book is not specifically devoted to India, the cover is. And that's an interesting reflection on how you could perhaps skew public perception of the contents of the book by what you put on the cover, which might not be a reflection so much of the contents. Examples of hunting literature. In Africa, Frederick Courtney Selous, A Hunter's Wanderings in 1881. A lot of information there on anthropology, that these people would go out into relatively unexplored parts of the country and would be reporting on the customs of the tribes they encountered, as well as on the animals they hunted and so on. Lots of illustrations of animals in Selous's book. Sorry, I don't have any images, I haven't had time to do that. A later book, African Nature Notes, is a bit more systematic, and actually he engages with Darwin and Wallace on the subject of animal coloration and dismisses Darwin's ideas about camouflage and animal coloration as camouflage and so on. This raises an interesting example that Selous does a lot of hunting, but then later in his career he's one of those hunters who starts to realise that we're going too far. We're starting to wipe out the species we're hunting, and he turns into a conservationist and starts to promote the need for game parks and preserves because if we don't stop this massive slaughter of animals, we will lose the animals. And this illustrates, I think, the changing perception that's just starting at this point, where what's originally the enthusiasm for big game hunting is a manly sport, to go out and conquer the environment and shoot the tiger and shoot the, whatever. A slow dawning that we're going too far and that we have to start conservation. And Seleucus' bust is on display in the Natural History Museum in London, not because of his hunting activities, but because of his later work as a conservationist. And so we get this change. Now, one point that I want to focus on here is this changing perception, because from the work I've been doing in India, and Indian material, the sense of attitudes towards dangerous animals like tigers and leopards is very much focused on practical realities. And as I say there, some of these examples that I'm reading in India talks about leopards, for instance, as dangerous vermin to be shot, because they kill the livestock of native families, and they kill the children. Leopards would take children and even adults. The story of the man-eaters, and they were real. There were man-eating tigers, which were greatly feared by the natives, and it was regarded as a public duty to go and shoot the damn things. So that this illustrates the different attitudes, the species that we now regard as desperately needing protection, because there were so few of them left. In the early 20th century was still so numerous that the fact that they presented a danger to ordinary people and their livestock allowed you to regard them as vermin to be shot. And in a sense, that big game hunting thus takes on a kind of moral justification, that you're helping the native people who are afraid of these man-eaters, or killing their sheep and goats and so on. And so hunting, which is for the European sport, I mean, this term is used routinely, that sportsman is the big game hunter, and again we find that as an uneasy use of the term today, sporting, to go out and kill animals. Not the way we think of it today, but that term sportsman is used routinely to describe a big game hunter. It's still in the early 20th century, but in this case, with the dangerous animals, you could justify the sport by saying that these are things we need to get rid of for public safety. So, interesting attitudes here to the animals. Now, examples of books that seek to arouse public interest in hunting in India and contain a good deal of natural history related to the animals. Richard Lydecker, who was a paleontologist, originally with the Indian Geological Survey, and did hunting himself in India when he was there. He's later based at the Natural History Museum in London. I don't think he had an official position, but he was given space there and published a huge number of popular natural history books while he was back in England. And he has two books on game animals, big game animals of India and then of Africa. So he's using his credibility as a naturalist, gained originally as a paleontologist, but that would reflect a general interest in zoology, to focus on the natural history of these periods, but particularly the animals that are hunted. So the hunting is quite an important theme in promoting an interest in natural history. And then there's a whole raft of books published by people who don't have any particular scientific credentials. As you can see, these are both army officers who use big game hunting as a recreation and published books on it, but these are, I've since, just literally over the last few days, I've come across dozens more of these, and there is a modern collection in an Oxford, the Oxford History of the Indian Wildlife, which extracts many of these. A lot of these are published in London, and this is where we move into the question of the audience, the readership back in Europe, in Britain, and the readership in India, because these people writing it, obviously they're writing about personal experiences in India, which will be of interest, they presume, to other people in India, but that they published back home in Britain to arouse interest in the exotic of the empire back home. Now, of course, if a book published in London, all the big London publishers would have agencies in India, so their books would be available in both locations. So one thing I want to try and look at and read these things more closely and see if I can get a sense of which readership are they primarily aimed at, or are they trying to balance both? I suspect they are trying to balance both and appeal both to the persons for whom the tiger hunting is an everyday activity, and to those back home for whom it's really exciting and exotic. But if they're appealing also to the Europeans in India, we have the fact that this sport, as they would call it, is to them an everyday activity, and other aspects of it, such as poisonous snakes, which I'll be mentioning in a moment. You live with poisonous snakes in your environment. Cobras and crepes, literally deadly snakes, are part of everyday experience in India and Malaysia. When I was there, we had cobras around. So the exotic becomes the everyday to the European living semi-permanently in the colony. And increasingly there is material published in India for Europeans based there. I came across this by accident originally. One of my first editions of Kipling is a first Indian edition of his Plain Tales from the Hills, one of his early collections of stories set amongst the British in India, which was originally published in India, and I have the Indian copy. And of course, typically of books published in Victorian Britain just after, the publisher includes his catalogue at the back of the book. And so I started flicking through the catalogue of this Indian edition, and suddenly there's this whole raft of hunting, shooting and fishing stories and natural history surveys, all published in India for British readers. So I thought, hang on, that's really interesting. So this is Thacker, Spink and Co., called Calcutta, Bombay and Shimla. There is a Thacker and Co. in London, obviously linked together. So this is a case of an Indian publisher with a London office, whereas most of them are London publishers with an Indian office. So you've got this seesawing backwards and forwards, and which is the primary source of the publication? Is it written and originally published in India and then published in Britain, or is it written and published in Britain and then sent to India? And I think we need to be aware of that difference. And here's some examples of material published primarily in India, although it would later be available in England. Jerdon's Mammals of India. Roorkee, I had to look up on the internet. It's a town north of Delhi, which was in the period that was published a major British army base, and a large engineering school was founded there. So though it's a relatively minor Indian city nowadays, it was quite important for the British then. Sterndale's book, Calcutta and London, Denizens of the Jungle, Bombay and London. That's an interesting book. It's a huge thing with these engravings of animals, quite an attractive book. But these are published in primarily, first publication is in India and then available back in Britain. And then, again, a whole list of them. E.H. Aitken, who published under his initials, EHA, A Common Bird of Bombay. That's pretty obviously aimed at the Indian reader for whom these birds are going to be of everyday experience. Naturalists on the Prowl is a more general thing, and these are articles, popular articles, originally published in the Times of India, one of the newspapers aimed at primarily at the British population. Stuart Baker, the Indian ducks and their allies, again, duck shooting was a popular pastime, so the hunting theme comes in with that one. And here's an example of a flyer that I've come across from the Bombay Natural History Society, I'll talk about in a moment. This is the Hand List of Birds of the Indian Empire by E.C. Stuart Baker, published by the Bombay Natural History Society. And this gives you details of the book. It's priced at 4 rupees a copy for a 250-page book on the birds. And then there's a little form at the bottom for you to fill in your name and address and send it off to the Bombay Natural History Society to order your copy of the book. So this is a very good example of material being by a British writer on Indian birds, published in India and being circulated amongst the British population in India. More examples. Frank Finn, who was a zoologist at the Indian Museum in Calcutta for the early part of his career, How to Know the Indian Waders, wading birds. Second edition, Calcutta, 1920, I've seen. And then he rewrites Sterndale's Mammals of India, a new edition in 1929. And then again, the explicit sporting link, Indian Sporting Birds, Calcutta and London, 1915. Height of the Great War, which is an interesting time for promoting these things, but there you are. And then Douglas Dewar, the Indian Civil Service, but he did have a degree in natural science, becomes a noted ornithologist. Animals of no importance, again extracted from Times of India, popular articles, Calcutta, Shimla and London. Beasts of an Indian Village, Bombay, London, Bombay and Calcutta. This is Oxford University Press in India, and this is Dewar's Beasts of an Indian Village, which I'll pass around, but please be very careful because the title page is glued to the illustration, and then it's come apart, so please be very careful looking at that. And the interesting thing about this book, which you will see if you open on the preface, is it's for children. This is for British children being raised in India. What sort of animals, and there's a parallel book on birds, what sort of animals and birds you will see in your local environment. It's for children, I know of interest to grown-ups too, but he's particularly pitching it at a level which will be of interest to children, but they're clearly English children, or British children, being that English-British thing is getting awfully awkward now with Brexit and Scottish independence and the possibility of a border poll in Northern Ireland and so on. British English is really a nightmare. Anyway, I'll pass that around. Just please be very, very careful with it, but you can have a look at it. But that's interesting. So we've not only got material being published for the British reader, but for British children specifically, being raised in India. So I picked that one up in Belfast a few weeks ago, and I saw birds of the Indian Village in the University Library in Cambridge on Monday. No, last week, a few days ago. Now, I've been in Finn and Dewar were names I already knew from an entirely different context, because they collaborated later on one of the few sort of anti-evolutionary books, or originally anti-Darwinian. Their book, The Making of Species, is a very anti-Darwinian book, published in 1909. And Dewar, when he comes back to Britain later on, emerges as an evangelical Christian, passionately opposed not only to Darwinism but to the whole idea of evolution. Becomes one of the founders of the evolution protest movement, the very small creationist opposition to Darwinism in Britain at the time, and writes books on that, debates with J.B.S. Haldane and other Arthur Keith and other notable evolutionists. He's clearly a very active evangelical Christian opposing evolution, which is interesting. I was dealing with Dawson, who was a Canadian attacking evolution in the late 19th century, and here we've got an Indian-based British nationalist attacking evolution in the early 20th century. And now this may be a pure coincidence, and I don't want to throw it out as anything serious, but is there, would be worth exploring the idea that if you were separated from the metropolis by maybe the other side of the Atlantic or right over in India, you were perhaps a little less in touch with what's being debated in London and a bit more inclined to be sceptical of theories such as evolutionism that are taking over amongst the scientific elite back home. I don't want to go any further with that, and please don't just ask me to justify it, but it's either a very odd coincidence or an indication of something that we might want to think more seriously about. So there we are. And now we move on to how am I doing for time? I'm doing way over on time, but never mind. Okay, I'm getting towards the end now, don't worry about it. I told you I hadn't done this before, so I had no idea how long it would take. The Bombay Natural History Society, founded in 1883, published as a journal from 1886. The first few editions are fairly straightforward, but from about volume 4, they start to include quite a lot of hunting material. And this is quite explicit. I've since, just recently, in the last week, I've come across material I've seen in the library in Cambridge, where they say quite explicitly they want to bring in the hunting material, partly because it's got some good natural history in it, and partly because it makes the journal more popular. It will reach a wider readership. It's a fairly big society by the early 20th century. The results I got in the report from 1923 has 1,280 ordinary members. Now, they wouldn't all have been based in Bombay and getting to regular meetings, but they were sufficiently interested to have their membership of the society recorded. This is a flyer advertising the society in the 1820s. The patron, the Prince of Wales. This is the future George, whatever it is, the one who abdicated, who we'll talk about more briefly later. And this is the details of it. They have the journal, they have a museum, which is eventually moved into a big museum called the Prince of Wales Museum in Bombay. And then you've got membership fee, 20 rupees for a life member, and so on. The privileges to get into the museum and the library. They have a fairly substantial library, and there's your application for membership if you want to join. The membership is mostly British, although there are a small number of mostly aristocratic Indians who join, but most of them British, the civil servants, and the medical service, the army officers, plantation managers, and so on. a few women, not many, but there are one or two female members, and they occasionally publish. But so there's a very small female component there, and that again is something one might want to explore, but I've only just started to come across this, so I can't go any further. And their activities, not only they publish, they do a survey of Indian mammals, they publish lots on shooting, and when the Prince of Wales visited in 1921-22, they organised a huge shooting expedition for him, and they go off and hunt tigers in the jungle. And the interesting thing is that the accounts of this, which are in the Bombay Natural History Society's proceedings, of which I have a copy here, which I'll pass around, this again turns up in a charity bookshop in Belfast, along with 3 or 4 other issues. And that's interesting. How did they get to Belfast? They aren't Lex Library copies. So presumably someone from Ireland was serving in India and thought it worth, these are heavy things, but I suppose if you've got a steamer trunk being brought back home when you retire, you can pack these things in it. But somehow several copies of this got back to Belfast. And I'll pass it around, but again, please be very careful. I've put cards in to illustrate some of the points that I'm talking about, and there are lots of photographs of the Prince of Wales expedition, so I flagged one of them there. You can see this is a huge article on the Prince of Wales expedition, but there's an official naturalist with the expedition who reports on the sort of things they're observing. So that, again, it's not just hunting for sport. They see themselves as generating real, in quote, scientific information about what's going on. Was it Bernard C. Ellison was the official naturalist. And another one that caught my attention there, just to illustrate the exotic nature by our standards, there's an article on the reptiles of Waziristan, noting that the collection of reptiles was made on a putative expedition against the hill tribes, because the only way Europeans could get into the area was with an army escort. So that gives you an idea of the sort of environment these people were living in. The army officers would often be engaged in these sort of activities up on the northwest frontier, and in some cases that was the only way that you could do natural history there. So that's the Bombay Natural History Society. I'm trying to. You can get those online, so I'm working my way through the other issues that I don't possess. But I'm always much happier to have the physical thing in my hand. I'm not a fan of online readers, partly because you get a sense of the physicality of what the thing was actually like for the reader by handling a thing like that, which you don't get from just seeing an image on the screen. And finally, I want to raise the issue of how natural history information gets into fiction. And is promoted, so natural history is promoted indirectly by being embedded in fictional accounts that include stories of hunting and so on. One example I mentioned there, Sir Percy Fitzpatrick's book Jock of the Bushveld, which is he was hunting in South Africa. Jock is his dog. There's Jock. Got at least a modern imagination of what Jock looked like. A pretty scruffy dog, but he turned out to be a damn good hunting dog. And the book is a lightly fictionalized account of real hunting experiences with the dog. And there's a huge amount of practical information about the animals of the African bushveld in this. Although as he says in his preface, he's tidied it up and changed the order of things around to make a better narrative and so on. It's all based on personal experiences with the animal. So there's a sort of loose sliding scale here between fiction and real experiences. Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines has an elephant hunt on the way to King Solomon's Mines, which he says is based on his own experiences hunting elephants when he was in Africa. So again, there's real life experiences of the wildlife embedded in a fictional account. And Wikipedia thinks that Edmund Courtney Selous, who I mentioned earlier, was the model for the hunter Alan Quatermain, who goes off on the expedition to King Solomon's Mines, and there are other books about him. But in fact, Haggard says that though the experiences are not borrowed from Selous, they are his own experiences whilst in South Africa. And Kipling, as I said, I'm a Kipling fan. Now, you all heard the Jungle Book, hopefully not the Walt Disney monstrosity that emerged from it. And that, of course, focuses only on the talking animals and so on. But in the books originally, there are several stories that are not related to Mowgli and the talking animals. One is Tumai of the Elephants, which is based, Tumai is an Indian lad who is with the army, and the collective elephants, which are extensively used by the army for hauling big guns around. And Rikki Tikki Tavi, which is the story of the mongoose, who saves a British family from a cobra in the garden, which is a family of cobras threatening to kill them. And again, Kipling tells us in the preface that this information about cobras and mongooses is based on one of the country's leading herpetologists who's dead now. For obvious reasons, he studied his poisonous snakes a bit too closely and got bitten. So again, there's some real natural history embedded in that. And there's a page I selected from my copy of it. There's the cobra with her egg in the mouth. She's trying to save her eggs, and Rikki Tikki Tavi, the mongoose, chasing after her and eventually kills them. Kills the whole nest of cobras. And this is a story of, this is an ordinary English family living in a bungalow in India, and these things. When we were in Malaysia, one of our friends had his kids were playing in the garden, and the gardener suddenly rushed in and said, "Get the kids indoors quickly!" And he went out with a big stick to a cobra, which he killed. I killed a centipede, yay long, in the house, rolled a rubber mat and beat the thing to death because they're poisonous. And whenever there was a rainstorm, pythons would be washed down and come out of the drains in the city and crawl around. And you got used to this kind of thing. It's this point of what's exotic to the reader of this back in England. It's a thing that will be everyday life to a family living in India. So that's the point that I want to make there, and that's more or less my conclusion. This sense of the exotic and the everyday, and the different audiences experiencing things in different ways, and Kipling is telling a story that would look quite familiar to an Indian reader, which sounds really exciting and different to a reader back home in England, and that's my conclusion there. What do I say? Interplay between the experiences of the European at home and abroad, the European at home on the information colonies, here we are, European science domesticated for those who actually lived in the colonies, and that sort of, I hope, sums up basically the point I've made, and I'm sorry if I've kept you going for far too long, but I finished now. Thank you.